Well, hey, folks, it's your old pal, King Waspinator. Another episode of the Philosophy of Darkness. This right here is an original copy of Changeling the Dreaming, first edition, from the very first print run, the very first batch of these books that showed up in Boulder, Colorado, which is where I was living at the time. This one in particular had been shoplifted from I want to say, a B. Dalton's at a mall by a friend of mine who I then in turn won from in a bet over how long archery class at our high school lasted. He thought it was half a semester. I said it was a quarter semester. I turned out to be correct. And so to this day, I still have this copy of Changeling, in large part just because of the fact that since my friend there was a rich kid who was a bit of an eccentric Robert Smith wannabe kind of type of guy, he would take ritual occult classes at a bookstore in Denver once a week. I went to one of those, and they didn't like me much because I kept asking awkward questions about exactly how all this was supposed to work. And I don't know. I just always thought it was kind of cool that I could say that I won this in a battle of wits from a ritual magician, with an asterisk. But anyway, Changeling the Dreaming. I've always kind of felt that low key, this is really the '90s World of Darkness's masterpiece. Because while being dressed up in silly antics and bright colors, it really is actually their darkest game. Because this is the game that's about death. It's written throughout the whole thing, the cycle of the history depicted in it, through the cycle of how changelings, go about their life cycle as they age, going from childling to wilder to grump. It's all about the inevitability of the end and the chill winds of winter, and that in the end, not only will you be gone, but you will be forgotten. And it's full of wonderful character archetypes to play in the form of the Cathane, all of which are embodiments of these interesting combinations of psychological tropes that, more than any other White Wolf game, I would say, maps onto the behavior models of a lot of actual people archetypes that people in life kind of fall into. I mean, as many human beings as there's only so many variations of the same set of genes that you will find. And so even though no one's quite identical, we do all kind of fall into certain kind of personality columns in some ways. And this game is really good at hitting on a lot of the core ones. Although a lot of the White Wolf games kind of try to do that in different ways. But like I said, this one is where they hit their peak. But not only is it about the cycle of life and death, starting off as a kid, growing up, growing older, and eventually, winter coming and all that kind of obvious analogies. There's the concept of that they're changelings. These are creatures that once had been on a rampage on this world until they were cut off from their dreaming state and were kind of trapped here, or kind of forced to take people over and live out their lives and kind of, jump from person to person, while the kind of magic, the glamour, the raw creativity of art and inventiveness is slowly dying out in the world, despite the fact that at the same time, historically, art has been proliferating and spreading. They are, and really in more ways, mythologically speaking, their archetype, they're based on fairy folk, but they operate like muses, the muse vampires and psychic vampires that feed off of people's creative outbursts, that they both inspire great works of art and invention, but they end up ultimately destroying that thing because they then reap the harvest of that creativity and drive the people who made these things insane, or eventually leave them uninspired and hollow shells where they can never really quite catch that moment of being in touch with the zeitgeist that they briefly had all those years ago and all that kind of stuff, but still trying to promote themselves as still being the guy who can do the thing. In terms of analogies that can be drawn to the real life, though, I think a real strong one is to be had about part of the tragedy of changeling is it's as much like the cycle towards death as it is the attempt to cling to the immortality of youth, that and the kinds of damage that does to yourself and your surroundings in a way that the changelings, in order to be able to keep hold of that glamour and that magic that they had so freely as childlings, have to become increasingly isolated from the rest of society, and are viewed as crazy because obviously they're still believing that they're fighting fantasy dragons and all that kind of stuff. Especially as they get up into the age of grump, it's still a bit forgivable when you're a wilder, but when you're a grump, it's not really quite so chill anymore. How is anyone supposed to take you serious when you have a wall full of Star Wars action figures in your house? Kind of a thing. But I feel like it typifies, if not in its own way encourages, but there's this whole thing throughout pop culture that's had kind of emerged post World War II. I don't really think it really started to pick up steam until the late 60s and onward, and definitely was kind of starting to really crystallize in the 80s and 90s. But there's this common theme in a lot of youth children's entertainment, children's programming, that promoted the idea that adulthood was kind of bad in its own way. That you should cling on to your childhood. You should try to stave off growing up as long as you can, and all that kind of stuff. And through all sorts of movies and TV shows. I'm sure you can think of a few if you sit and ponder for a moment. Probably more than one of them starring Tom Hanks. But in Changeling, like I said, these are creatures that are doing that. And much of our generation and downward, Generation X on, all kind of suffers from this thing. Kind of a Peter Pan mentality. I would almost call it we're, as a greater generation, we're the Lost Boys generation, because we're the generation of people who try not to grow up and still cling to our childhood shit and still watch our childhood programmings. There is a point, if you go backwards far enough, where people's parents or grandparents were not still collecting, memorabilia of movies they watched when they were 8. My grandfather doesn't have a bunch of Howdy Doody shit all over his house, or Bozo the Clown shit all over his house, because he got to an age where, the real world took over, and he had to go shoot people in Korea and all that kind of shit. So, whereas, we've not had to suffer that. And some of it is that own generation's fault, because they had a horrible experience with the various wars they went through between World War I, II, Vietnam, and there's been this effort to try to make everyone nicer. Unfortunately, that has not been distributed evenly across the entire planet, because the entire planet is not likely to ever be on the same page about everything, and it's probably for the best. If all of humanity was all of one mind, that's probably a sign that something terrible has happened. But I digress. Changeling, the dreaming. As the changelings age, like I said, there's just the obvious repercussions to their mortal life, where they become increasingly isolated socially, detached from what everyone else is doing. They leave behind their life to go out, hang out in the wilderness where they think there's a freehold and all that stuff that no one else can see and all that kind of stuff. But also, it's the things that they have to do to keep renewing their glamour as they get older, too. And the way that changelings harvest their glamour. In their own way, as I said, they are a psychic vampire. A lot of the creatures in the World of Darkness games, not all of them, but a couple of them, have to feed off of humanity in one form or fashion. Vampires are possibly the most literal of that, in terms of drinking blood and actually killing the person physically right then and there, if they choose to. But, demons and changelings and even wraiths, maybe to some minor degree, they all have to harvest some sort of psychic essence out of regular people in order to be able to sustain their magic and whatnot. And the way changelings do it ruins people's lives. So on one hand, the isolation that they're having from, their jobs and families and people they know, is kind of wrecking the lives around them just because they're off trying to, still maintain, this hold on their fairy soul that they had a stronger grasp on when they were young. But they're literally ruining the very people they need to maintain, the actual true art. And so maybe the analogy is like, because this is like why art has become so commercialized and cynical. Like modern art and modern painting is all just a giant money laundering scam. It has nothing at all to do with art, and that's probably why they sponsor and pay for so much art stuff in school and encourage artists, because it's more opportunities to launder money. If they can justify art being worth however many millions of dollars, and then you donate it to a charity and yada yada yada. Just a cynical, formulaic, corporate way that, all these stories that, not just, modern day repackaged retellings of stuff, but even the way, like, we'll try to adapt ancient shit, like the story of Robin Hood or King Arthur or, like, Thor. I mean, like, look at what Marvel is doing with the Norse pantheon. You know how much of an outrage you'd have in India if Marvel was doing that with all, the Indian gods, because they still have a significant living following, whereas Scandinavia, despite being the happiest place on earth on some levels, kind of feels like it's given up, considering that was the land where, the term going a Viking came from. But, also, that's, I guess, neither here nor there. Changelings have to do, like, I don't know, like, they're not violent. They're not, wrecking people in the way that werewolves can. They're not destroying reality itself in the way that mages potentially can and are. But they're taking the very thing that they love most about humanity and ultimately feeding on it just so that they can maintain themselves, and all they're really gaining for attaining themselves is just to live in a literal fantasy land away from those who are concerned about them in the real world. And my God, what have we ourselves, like, are all of us adult fans of stuff? Are we changelings in our own way? You decide, and hit like and subscribe and all that other kind of stuff. And next, I don't know, it's a flip of the coin. Do I go into Mummy the Resurrection, or do I discuss Kindred of the East and Hengeokai and all of that? Only time will tell. Stay waspinated.